Today it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Peyman Jafari, who is a associate research scholar at our center here. Dr. Jafari arrived last semester. He is a graduate of Leiden University in history. I have a PhD in history, and often when we talk to our students who have just finished their dissertation, we tell them that you need to expand your dissertation a little bit into a book manuscript. This is Peyman's dissertation, and if some of you are thinking about a morning exercise, I would invite you to just carry this book with you, see how heavy it is. We are trying to do the opposite for Peyman, to find a way to shrink this dissertation into a book manuscript. What wonderful, wonderful study of oil workers in Iran, and some of which you're going to hear about today. Dr. Jafari is a prolific writer and also a public speaker on questions of politics and modern history of Iran. He's rather a well-known commentator in the Netherlands, and we are very fortunate to have him here with us. He has published numerous book chapters and articles, and has co-edited a volume, which I also highly recommend, Iran in the Middle East, Transnational Encounters and Social History, co-edited with Hushan Shahabi, who's going to be visiting us in March, I believe, and Maral Jefrudi. He's been a visiting scholar at SOAS, at NYU, Columbia. Columbia, not NYU. And here he is. He's going to talk for 45 to 50 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for your comments and questions. Thank you, and let's welcome Peyman Jafari.
Well, thanks for coming here, and Berus, thanks for your kind introduction, and also for giving me the opportunity to present my work today here. And also Becky Pernian, thanks for facilitating the meeting and helping with the beautiful design of the poster. So as you see on the slide behind me, I'm going to talk about oil, labor, and the making of the Iranian Revolution. And seeing the dots, you might think I have spilled some oil on the slides. That's unfortunately not the case. I'm one of those poor fellows who study oil, doesn't own much of it. But luckily for me, I get the time to talk to you and exchange some ideas on this topic. So as Berus was also explaining, this talk is based on my research done for my dissertation. And I'm also very grateful for having the time at Princeton University at the Iran Center to actually shrink that book into dissertation into a book project. I position my own work at the intersection of three historiographic fields, being concerned with oil, the Pahlavi era, and the Iranian Revolution. But to give you the broader context of my research and the approach that informs it, I want to start by addressing the following two questions. Why study oil in the first place? And then if we study oil, how to study oil? How should it be studied? When you look at any era, you will discern certain commodities that really define those ages, those eras. So when you look, for instance, to the 18th century, that was the era of sugar and sugar plantations. Sugar consumption in Britain rose fivefold between 1710 and 1770, and by 1750, it had surpassed grain as the most valuable commodity in European trade. The French Enlightenment writer Guillaume Thomas de Reynaud even called sugar the principal cause of the rapid movement which stirs the universe. During the 19th century, cotton production was central to the Industrial Revolution as it developed around textile manufacturing, and in turn, cotton production heavily depended on war-making, colonial expansion, exploitation, and enslaved labor. As Jürgen Osterhammel has argued, the 19th century was also the century of coal, of course. The rise of coal marked the transition from above-ground sources of energy, being humans, plants, animals, wind and water, to subterranean sources of energy. Coal fueled the steam engines that enabled the massive expansion of transport and industry. By the time that coal had reached its zenith as a source of energy in the second decade of the 20th century, it was being replaced by another fossil fuel, oil. After the first commercial oil well was dug in 1859 in Pennsylvania, oil production took off in the following decades in the US, in Mexico, in Baku, Venezuela, and later on in the Middle East. The First World War was a turning point as the British Navy switched from coal to oil, enabling its ships to run faster. Oil became an increasingly important source of energy in industry, transport, and private consumption. The development of refinery and petrochemical technology led to a fundamental transformation of the everyday lives of millions of people as petrol-driven automobiles increased mobility and petroleum products such as lubricants, nylon, and plastic helped to create hundreds of new consumer products. Oil became also a fundamental component of domestic and international politics. Hence, calling the 20th century the century of oil will not surprise anyone, I think. But how is oil then studied? Just as crude oil can be distilled and cracked through chemical and chemical processes into dozens of products in refineries, its history has been processed into various narratives as well. Some histories of oil have been told from the vantage point of the venture capitalists, mainly European and American men, who searched the bowels of the earth for black gold from the mid-19th century to early 20th century. These were the oilmen, so vividly depicted in Upton Sinclair's classic novel Oil, on which the movie There Will Be Blood is based as well. William Knox Dorsey, here on the right, was one of these men. Born in England, he funded the search for oil in Iran in 1900, winning a concession from the Qajar king to exploit it for 60 years. And luckily for him, his expedition found oil in southern Iran in 1908, just as he was facing bankruptcy. This discovery marked the beginning of the Anglo-Persian oil company, to which I will refer as APOC in the rest of the story, that was later renamed British Petroleum. So another historical narrative that developed was around these kind of large multinational companies as BP, the Royal Dutch Shell, etc. Yet another corpus of publications has emphasized the role of oil as a source of rent. Since the Iranian economist Hossein Mahdavi coined the concept rentier state in 1970, hundreds of books and articles have been published on the oil curse, oil's supposed capacity to create dictatorships, economic stagnation, and civil wars. Despite their differences, all these genres have one thing in common. They all write labor out of the history of oil production, transportation, and consumption. This stems from a reified conceptualization of oil, or as Marx would call it, commodity fetishism par excellence, as it obscures the social relations of production in which oil is embedded. And hence, oil appears to us as a magical thing. This is quite well reflected in a passage that Richard Kopuscinski wrote on the 1970s Iran. Oil creates the illusion of a completely changed life, life without work, life for free. The concept of oil expresses perfectly the eternal human dream of wealth achieved through lucky accident. In this sense, oil is a fairy tale, and like every fairy tale, a bit of a lie. Writing the history of oil differently means, therefore, to demystify and to dereify it by looking at how labor shapes the social relations, politics, cultures, that are formed as oil flows from the wells into pipelines, arriving in refineries and petrochemical complexes, following its route into tankers, ports, distribution centers, and gas stations. This new way of thinking about oil has produced a new research program around the idea of energy humanities, to which I also hope to contribute. Much of the energy humanities literature at the moment is really based on the cultural aspect, consumption culture aspect of oil, which I also will try to do in my forthcoming book as well. But today, I want to take more the social approach, the social history approach to it by focusing on the role of labor and more in particular labor activism as it shaped defining moments in Iranian history, particularly the Iranian revolution. So there have been three moments in modern Iranian history in which oil activism, oil workers' activism has played a defining role. These were in 1929, 1946, and 1978, the Iranian Revolution. And I had promised myself to not talk too much about 1929 and 1946, so I have time for the Iranian Revolution. But being a historian, I can't really leave that out. So I will try to be brief on those moments. 1929 is important because that was really the first moment of such a general strike in the oil industry in southwestern Iran, in Abadan, in the refinery. And why was this important? Because first of all, it reflected the emergence of popular politics in Iran. Stephanie Cronin has written a beautiful article on this, the emergence of the mass strike, and also the agency of this industrial working class. But I think it was also important in two other aspects. Namely that this was a time of state formation in Iran. Under Reza Shah, authoritarian modernization. But this oil strike, in fact, very much influenced that process of state formation and how the state was defining its relationship with the forces above it, the international forces, but also the forces below it, the society, the societal forces. So in terms of the international component, Reza Shah was trying to renegotiate the Darcy concession, to which I already referred, in 1928. He had his Minister of Court, Teymour Tash, do the renegotiations. And often in the history of the oil strike, the social demands of the workers are talked about. And this is given the condition of the workers at that time, it was miserable, wages were low, housing was very bad in cities like Abadan. So the workers did indeed have much of those social economic demands. But they were also rising, in fact, the demand against the British oil company and the managers and calling for the renegotiation of the Darcy concession. So the demand was not only coming from the state elites, but it was also really coming from workers themselves, and particularly, of course, the more militant activists among them, inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, etc. So it played an important role in that aspect, but it also defined the state-society relations because it really put on the agenda the social question in Iran. Because the Shah was modernizing Iran, creating a new modern industry. But how do you integrate this modern working class and how do you discipline them? In order to do that, you will also need regulations, laws, and so on. So the oil strike really gave an impetus to put the social question on the agenda and start thinking about regulations and laws. So for instance, 8 months after the end of the oil strike, when Reza Shah went to Abadan, his minister, Teymour Tash, actually tried to get a concession from the oil company of 5% wage increase to actually show to the workers and the emerging working class that the new system was also trying to accommodate them in order to prevent such strikes in the future. And this dynamic was also visible in the mass strike of 1946 in Abadan, during which also the demand of oil nationalization, again, was not only called on by Prime Minister Mossavar, who was leading the oil nationalization movement, but also was really called on by oil workers themselves. In fact, this is also interesting to know, the participation of women in both of the strikes of 1929 and 1946 was remarkable. And one of the women during this demonstration was calling in 1946 already for the nationalization of the oil industry, which was nationalized in 1951, and the strikes continued into 1953 as well. So, and this was also the moment of the really birth of resource nationalism. Again, not only as an elite discourse, but also something that was driven by the forces within society. Now coming to the revolution and the role of the oil workers, let me first give you an overview of the revolutionary process. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story, so I won't go into details, but just to give you the overview. And I'm here actually following Dr. Ashraf's periodization of the revolution, in which the demonstrations, petitions, the demands start in 1977, driven mainly by lawyers, doctors, students, writers, who write petitions demanding civil liberties. But the demonstrations really start from January 1978 in cycles of 40 days, because with every demonstration, dozens of people were shot and killed, and according to Shia tradition, they were commemorated 40 days later, and the same would happen, so you had this cycle of 40 days, demonstrations well into the summer of 1978. But then after the summer, something very different starts. Mainly industrial action, strikes in industrial centers of Iran, mainly also, of course, in the oil industry. And that continues until February 1979. That's the period that you could call as the situation of dual power, because parallel to the existing state, institutions emerge that are challenging that sovereignty of the existing state, like the Islamic Neighborhood Committees, the coordination committees, and I will return to this, that is created to coordinate the oil strikes, the Secret Council of the Islamic Revolution, that is led by Ayatollah Khomeini, who returns to Iran on 1st of February. But the oil strikes themselves went also through, I distinguish at least 4 distinctive phases of the oil strikes. And given the importance of the oil strikes during the revolution, it is in fact surprising that no serious historical account has been yet written on the development of these strikes. By going through SOAS reports, newspapers, and interviews with oil workers, I have tried to reconstruct the day-to-day development of the oil strikes in some detail, but I will limit myself here to the main landmarks. So the first strikes started on 8th of September in Tehran refinery and spread to the oil fields of southern Iran. This prompted the SOAS, the Shah's secret police, to report that the oil strikes have no precedent in recent years. The strikes must have developed among workers in the National Oil Company very quickly, end of quote. In an addendum to the report, SOAS registered 21 strikes in the oil industry in the 10 days between 17 and 26 September, involving 11,000 oil workers. And according to a US Embassy report, the blue-collar workers in Khuzestan presented a list of 48 demands, topped with a 50% wage increase. Indeed, the strikes had a largely spontaneous character, which also meant that by early October, the oil strikes had subsided after officials made some concessions. But a second wave started when oil workers in Abadan staged a sit-in on 16th of October. 2 days later, the white-collar workers in the oil company offices of Ahwaz joined them, starting a strike that lasted for 33 days. At about the same time, the blue-collar workers in the oil fields near Ahwaz went on strike as well. These strikes faded in the last 2 weeks of November, but in the meantime, oil workers had become better organized. The oil strikes, like any other class-based protest, involved an uneven and complex process of social mobilization in which demands were articulated differently depending on the position of the workers in the labor process, their traditions of activism, and the culture in their cities, and so on. Oil workers' propensity to strike differed, of course, but the resulting tensions were usually overcome by persuasion or social pressure, as always happens in these kind of general strikes. So let me give you two examples of these different kind of pressures. One, which also exemplifies this issue of how the different mentalities are created depending on people's position in the labor process, for instance. Because in the Abadan refinery, the most militant workers were based in the central workshop. They were also the older workers, had lots of experience working in there, but this was also a huge workshop bringing together several hundred of workers who day-to-day worked together and went through this long experiences. So they were very willing to take action. On the other extreme of the spectrum, you had the process workers who worked in night shifts in the process rooms, the control rooms of the refinery. There you had 3, 4, or at most 5 workers coming together. So they were much more hesitant in joining the revolution because they were also much more vulnerable. The managers could immediately see who those workers were. But also their work, them going on strike, meant an irreversible consequence, namely the shutdown of the whole refinery, because the whole process, the chemical processes, would come to a standstill. So first, there was lots of pressure on these workers to join them. In an interview, one of the Tehran workers gave me an anecdote of them sending a headscarf to these workers from Tehran, basically laughing at them like you're acting like women, and we rightly would consider that as very sexist nowadays, but that was their way of telling them, join the revolution, why are you being so soft? But also there were examples of more violent pressure. So when these workers were not joining at the end of December, January, other workers would actually gather in front of the buses that would take them from their houses to the refinery to protest them, to call them to join the revolution. But overall, there would be these processes of negotiations and slowdowns and strikes. I have only seen a few examples of real violence actions that didn't actually come from the oil workers themselves, but from Islamist activists that were trying to target the managers of the oil industry. So on 23rd December, 3 gunmen of the Islamist guerrilla group Mujahideen ambushed and killed Paul Brim, the American general director of the oil company in Ahvaz, who had replaced George Link after his car was bombed in November. On the same day, an Iranian oil official, Malek Boroujerdi, the father of Professor Boroujerdi, was killed in Ahvaz as well. So, but again, these were on the margins of the oil strike. Most important were the attempts to organize and expand the organizations on which the strikes were built. At Abadan refinery, the blue-collar workers formed a 13-member strike committee in late October. They were in contact with the strike committee of the white-collar workers in Ahvaz, the Association of the Oil Industry Staff Employees, that consisted of 60 representatives elected from different departments of the company. A founding member explained the process as following. The representatives were not elected by secret ballot. The vote took place in front of everyone. We put up a list on the wall. People came and signed their names next to the name of their preferred candidate. There were usually 5 or 6 candidates per position. The first duty of these representatives was to organize the Association of Professional and Office Workers. So we called this body the Organizing Committee of Oil Industry Employees. The association was further formalized in the last week of November with the election of a coordination committee. In Tehran refinery, a secret strike committee of blue-collar workers had been active since September, but a new committee including white-collar workers was established in the second week of November. Its 12 representatives were selected from the various refinery departments. In later November, the Common Syndicate and the employees of the Iranian oil industry was established to represent for the first time both the blue-collar workers and the white-collar workers in a common syndicate of the employees of the Iranian oil industry. By late October, oil workers were demanding, among other things, an end to the martial law, the release of all political prisoners, Iranianization of the oil industry, and an end to discrimination against female employees, and the dissolution of SOAS. The composition of the strike committees differed from place to place, but often the leading members belonged to or sympathized with the organizations of the secular left, including the Fadayan and to lesser degree the Tudeh Party, or the Islamist leftist People's Mujahideen. Others were followers of Ayatollah Khomeini or independents. It is notable, however, that when the strikes erupted, the presence of the organized left was very weak among the oil workers, as state repression had diminished the space for political activity in the oil industry, but this was also exacerbated by the guerrilla strategy of the main organizations of the left that made it very difficult to kind of organize more openly. During the strikes, however, the left recruited new members and increased its influence. In Ahvaz, 35% of the delegates of the strike committee that all workers had elected in November self-identified as Marxists. But after the fall of the monarchy, the supporters of Ayatollah Khomeini, in coalition with liberal Islamic figures like Mehdi Bazargan, who headed the provisional government, maneuvered to marginalize the left and organized new elections in which the left gained 15%. It is worth noting that religiously inspired worker militants were active as well. And I'm emphasizing because there are basically two parallel histories of the Iranian Revolution. One given by the official historians of the Islamic Republic that only emphasize the leading role of Ayatollah Khomeini, and then you have often the leftist histories that only emphasize the role of the leftist organizations. But from my view, they both were really active in the strikes as well. It is worth noting that religiously inspired worker militants were active as well, and that at this stage, ideological differences and party lines were not sharply defined. Moreover, among the religious workers, many identified with the class politics advocated by lay intellectuals like Ali Shariati. One could find a plethora of both Islamist and socialist discourses among the oil workers that were often indistinguishable. Interviewing Abadan oil workers, one journalist observed, "Most of the oil workers are devout, practicing Muslims, but of the anti-clerical kind that believe that a religious movement, which began with the uncompromising demand for the removal of the Shah, will not end until religion itself undergoes radical change. We give Khomeini due respect for so stubbornly refusing to compromise with the Shah," said a oil maker in Abadan refinery. But after all, Dr. Shariati wrote this revolution, Khomeini only led it. "We are not going to be slaves to these machines," says a young welder. In an Islamic republic, the community and not consumption is the goal. This gives you an impression of the different mentalities and discourses present at the time. Having established a stronger organizational structure, the oil workers resumed their strikes in early December, initiating the third phase. I should have done this. The third phase of these strikes. Following Khomeini's call for a general strike on 2nd of December to coincide with the beginning of the holy month of Muharram, the Common Syndicate issued a call for a general strike in the oil industry. The Abadan refinery took the lead once again, but the strike spread to the offshore oil platforms and the Ahvaz and Maroon oil fields in the following days. In Gajsaran and Al-Ghajari, workers were forced to work at bayonet point, but they went on strike at the end of the second week of December. The government's increased repression in December backfired, as over 6,000 oil workers quit their jobs when officials threatened to dismiss the strikers. The fourth and the final phase of the oil strikes that started in the last days of 1978 wasn't marked by an interlude, but more by a qualitative change. And that's what I already explained, the emergence of dual power situation based on these different institutions. The strike committees of the oil workers had taken control of oil production at the local level by that time. But more importantly, they were essential in the creation of dual power, as the oil strikes functioned as the launching pad for the three main institutions that emerged parallel to the existing state. First of all, the first organization was the organization that was established by Ayatollah Khomeini to coordinate the oil strikes. And that was led by Bazargan, here arriving in Abadan, accompanied by Rafsanjani, who was also in this oil coordination committee. And by the way, if you listen to the names, these are all big figures in the Iranian Revolution, and gives you a sense of the importance of this committee. Because also, as Bazargan explained in his interviews and memoirs, he was particularly important in convincing Ayatollah Khomeini in the creation of this organ, because he realized that taking control over the oil strikes would give authority to the whole revolutionary leadership around Khomeini. Khomeini. And that happened as well, because in the first weeks of January, the Islamic Revolution Council was established, building on a previously existing committee, but the oil strikes really gave it that kind of authority. And the third, but not last, important organ of dual power were the neighborhood committees that were established in dozens of cities. And these were created basically based on the necessity to distribute fuel that was caused because of the shortages of the strikes, and it was winter, don't forget, in January in Iran. So you had young people bringing basically fuel to different houses or queuing, and new forms of solidarity and stories would emerge in these gatherings as people waited for oil distribution. But these oil distribution activities were central in bringing the youth together, sometimes around mosques, sometimes not, to organize the neighborhood committees that were established later. So this is one of the main arguments I make in my book to demonstrate how the struggle over the control over the oil strikes revealed the very political nature of the revolution, also in terms of the relationship that Ayatollah Khomeini established with the mass movement as a whole. So we have seen that the oil strikes were important, but why did oil workers participate in them? That's another question that I want to put on the table here. In order to answer that question, this were, by the way, the oil distribution centers of the oil industry. To answer that question, I want to give you three dominant representations of oil workers in Iran. One representation of oil workers that is familiar, is, I think, conveyed in this painting by Nusratullah Muslimian from 1978. You see in the corner, oil workers are depicted in their workplace. Very harsh job under the ground. It's just like, reminds you of Émile Zola's kind of working in the coal industry. And I think that's really the inspiration and the message that he's trying to convey. And in the very right corner, that's the community level. You see the wives of the oil workers mourning for the victims and having a miserable life in their community as well. And in the center, of course, you see the workers marching under the red banner to their liberation. Well, I bring this up because this is obviously one narrative about the oil workers, which, going back to the 1929 strike and 1946 strike, sees as very dominant this leftist discourse and tradition among oil workers. But I really think that it forgets how the oil worker communities and them as a class were basically reformed during the 1960s and 1970s new ideologies, new ways of life coming into the industry. So I think this is too crude and simplistic. The other narrative that is, of course, very much conveyed by the Islamic leaders of the Iranian Revolution is that the workers were just pious people who would follow Ayatollah Khomeini into the revolution. So also there, not a surprise, they were pious. Why wouldn't they participate the revolution? And then the third narrative that was conveyed by the monarchy and the managers of the oil industry and their supporters is that, well, the oil workers were leading a very happy life. The oil industry was taking care for them in their work, in their communities. They could go to the pool, there were shops for them, etc. So the fact that they joined the revolution must have been the work of manipulative agitators that then fooled them to join the revolution. And I think you can tell this story about all kind of revolutions of this kind of narratives. And I mean, there is always a kernel of truth in each of them, but together I don't think they give you a picture of the complex reality of the oil worker's life. So the socioeconomically, oil workers were relatively better off than some others. But they did have grievances that resonated with demands of the revolutionary movement at large. Most importantly, they were not homogeneous. There would be huge wage differences between unskilled workers, skilled workers, the white-collar workers, and definitely the managers who would earn 4 to 5 times more than unskilled workers. Another huge difference was between those who were working for the oil company and who were working as subcontractors. And you can see that in this line. You see a rise of the number of subcontractors well into the 1970s. And of course, after the revolution, that increases more. And with more of the trends under the Islamic Republic, we see that there's also some continuity with what was happening before the revolution. And that was a huge grievance, because if you were not employed by the oil company, you could not benefit from, for instance, insurance or overwork, etc. But the main grievance of the workers was really this huge gap between, to which I have already referred, the blue-collar workers, which were kargar in Iran, and the white-collar workers, the karmans. And this was institutionalized at every level of the oil industry. So they would go to different shops, they would go to different cinemas, they lived in different neighborhoods of Abadan, and the blue-collar workers were not allowed to go to the neighborhoods of the white-collar workers. They had different buses taking them to the work, so this created huge resentment, particularly among the blue-collar workers. One example, I interviewed an oil worker who was, another anecdote, telling me that he would always go into the toilets of the white-collar workers and destroy their soaps and mirror and everything, because he just resented the fact that he had to go to another toilet. And also what I explained about the overall wages of the oil workers being better than other categories, don't forget that they at the same time lived in hard conditions. So working in the oil industry meant, for instance, working in temperatures reaching sometimes 130 degrees in Abadan or Ahvaz. There was, by the way, another gap that was the ethnic gap in Iran, because in southern Iran, a significant part of the population are Arabs, but only 5 to 10% were employed in the oil industry. By the way, I couldn't find any official figures about this, because it was also, just as now, it was really treated as a sensitive and a security issue. But there was a huge overlap between what I said about the subcontractors and the Arab workers, because you see here, these are Arab workers working for a subcontractor in mainly unskilled jobs in the oil industry. I also want to point out the gender aspect, because the oil industry was very much, and still is very much, male-dominated. It's also a very much masculine kind of industry. You had few number of women working in the administrative functions of the oil industry, and some were making it into engineering positions as well in the latter days of the 1970s. So, two other grievances that I want to point out. One has to do with this resentment against foreign domination, and I already explained that there was a tradition of this going back to the colonial era under the British, and later American managers being very dominant in the oil industry. And this was not only an ideological thing, because in the 1970s there was this huge resentment against imperialism, anti-imperialism as a discourse was very influential. But I would say that this really had also a social component, because I figured out the numbers of white-collar positions that were in the hands of foreigners, mainly Americans and Europeans. And you see an increase in the 1970s. So for the Iranian white-collar workers, this was seen as an obstacle for them to, going up the ladder of the hierarchy in the oil industry. Then there was also the authoritarian relationships in the oil industry. And of course, this was the case in many other industries in Iran as well, because free labor unions were not allowed. The SOAS was present in vetting who was getting to represent workers and even being employed in sensitive positions in the oil industry and so on. But I think this was particularly felt in the oil industry because there was a huge contradiction. The discourse of the oil company managers and the Shah was, the oil industry is the forefront of Iranian modernization. This is the place of meritocracy. This is progress. And at the same time, you would feel that, on the workplace level, you didn't feel much about this progress in terms of political opening up. And this was even experienced by loyalist workers as such, because I found this SOAS report on a meeting of the Rastakhi's party, that was the official party under the Shah. And SOAS was doing a great job, by the way, because we don't have much accounts by the workers themselves, so they would be at these meetings and writing this stuff up. So it quotes one of the workers, and it says, "Today, workers enjoy benefits they couldn't have dreamt of, but it is not right for the directors to decide the workers' fates behind closed doors and not to be accountable to them." So even white-collar workers that were feeling the material progress, they also wanted to be part of what was happening. So how long do I have? 5 minutes? Sure. So I'm not simply arguing that oil workers had pre-existing grievances that spurred them to join the revolution. That would really ignore 4 decades of social movement and revolution studies that have highlighted how these processes are mediated by resources, by ideologies, by political opportunities, and so on. Grievances are of course important, but building on William Sewell's notion of eventful temporality, I argue that it is essential to understanding how the broader revolutionary mobilization created the conditions in which the nature of those grievances themselves were transformed, and the horizon of what was deemed possible changed dramatically in that process. And I think this is also important to understand the revolution, and I think revolutions in general. Take, for instance, the social gap that I already mentioned about existing between white-collar workers and blue-collar workers. I mean, many blue-collar workers accepted this gap during the 1970s and before. But the whole revolutionary mobilization really changed the way that they were experiencing and looking to this gap, because suddenly, why would they accept it? There was this whole new possibility of reorganizing the workplace and society in different ways. I mean, realistic or not, but this was the mentality that became very dominant through the revolutionary process itself. And I think Rosa Luxemburg has also a very interesting work about this relationship between politics and general strikes, because we often think that there is a linear way between you have economic demands going into political demands, but sometimes it actually goes around and moves into the workplaces. So these moments of rupture and rapid shifts, moments of madness, according to Aristotle Zollberg, are constitutive to revolutions. However, they are not mystical, and it is possible to discern the events that have such a transformative impact on individuals. It wasn't only the revolution that transformed the consciousness of oil workers, but it was also in turn the actions of oil workers that transformed the consciousness of millions of Iranians, because the oil strikes demonstrated the fatal vulnerability of the state. By early 1979, the strikes had caused a serious fuel shortage, creating an acute awareness of the gravity of the crisis that engulfed the state, because an increasing number of Iranians were directly experiencing the consequences. For instance, when queuing for oil. Where did it go? Here. No, because at the later months of 1978, the newspapers were shut down. So first of all, it was the radios that were reporting on the strikes, because there were fuel shortages. So people knew what was happening. Both the workers themselves, but also the majority of the population was really feeling the impact of the oil strikes. And this is, I think, very important because it pinpoints what Charles Kurtzman calls a viable movement, a movement that has the perception that it can actually successfully challenge the state. And I think the oil strikes were a shifting point of creating this sense of viability, not only among oil workers, but in the population at large. And I want to just round up by going back to this figure, by bringing together also why I think that the materiality of oil and social processes and cultures are so important to be understood together in their intertwined relationship. So you see here, this is the total number of oil workers. In the early 1970s, the oil industry was expanding rapidly, also because the oil price was going up. The Shah was investing into the oil industry, building new refineries in Isfahan and other places, building petrochemical complexes and so on. So what did this was actually attract thousands of new workers into the oil industry, so hence the increase in the number of workers. But this had an impact because this new generation also brought with them new experiences. And I already mentioned, for instance, the blue-collar workers in Abadan's workshop. They were experienced, but this could cut both ways. They had experience of trade union activism, but they also had the experience of the defeat of 1953 and the coup d'etat and the repression under the Shah. The white-collar workers that were now coming in, they were often influenced by leftist ideas, by anti-imperialism, student activism, and so on. And they had these links with the wider society. And together with a segment of blue-collar workers, they could kind of take the lead in the oil industry in organizing them. Also, another factor that points to this materiality is why were the oil workers able to organize effectively? Because within the oil industry, the labor process, for instance, in the refineries, was that once in a year you have to close down the whole refinery. That's called the overhaul process to kind of maintain the whole system. When you do this, you really need a huge number of workers that cannot be drawn from the existing pool of workers in the refinery. So you have to bring them from somewhere else. So in Tehran, they would bring them from Abadan. So also before the revolution, every year, workers would go there. What happens there? These workers would get together, talk to each other during lunchtime, and have the contacts. So during the revolution, they would reach out to each other and create the networks. And also the educational system of the oil industry contributed to this process enormously, because the oil industry tried to recruit from the children of the oil workers. They were giving priority in the recruitment. So you had actually a pool of workers within their own communities that had these experiences and these social contacts and social networks. So for me, it's also important to really emphasize that understanding these kind of strikes and revolutionary processes is not only about the workplace, it is also about, the social reproduction that goes on in the family, in the community, and the social networks that are built in that process. So I want to conclude there, so we will have time for some questions.